Welcome to the next section of the course. In this section, we're going to talk about testing in React. So first up, you may be curious, what exactly is testing? You may be brand new to the practice. So testing refers to writing code that verifies that our existing code, our application code, works as expected. So we're kind of putting the computer to work for us because as developers, we obviously test our code every single day. We may run our program from the command line, or in the case of a front-end application, we may launch the app in our browser and click around much like a regular user would. But the testing that we're referring to here is automated testing, letting things like JavaScript automatically run some bit of logic and then verify that the result was what we expected. So what a test does is it executes some logic and then we assert or confirm that the expected result occurred. And testing is not just limited to React, it's a general programming principle that you can do in any programming language. So as a very simple example, what we can do in a test is invoke a function with specific arguments and then assert or verify that the function produced the correct return value. This is a perfect example of something that we can automate because we can tell JavaScript, take this function that we wrote, run it, and compare its return value to what we told you should be its return value, right? So there's no need to do this work manually by ourselves if we can get JavaScript to automate it for us. And that's what we're going to try to do with React in this section. And what we can do when it comes to React testing is things like rendering a component, verifying that the component displays what it should, simulating a user click or simulating a user keyboard press into an input, and then verifying that those actions produced the expected change in the component or in the UI that the user sees. So everything that we've been doing in the browser so far, while still valuable, we can still emulate, we can replicate using JavaScript. And of course, that's super convenient because it's super fast, it's efficient, and of course, automated. JavaScript can run through this logic almost like a human programmer and verify that what should happen is indeed what does happen. So here are some of the technologies we're going to be using in this section. We're going to be using the Jest test runner from Facebook, and we're also going to be using the React testing library from Kent C. Dodds. So let's talk a little bit about these technologies and what exactly they do. So first up, let's talk about the two primary testing options in the React ecosystem. So the two libraries that we have here, Enzyme and React Testing Library, are specific to React. And what they do is they render React components. So typically we render React, of course, in our browser, in something like Chrome, where we can see the components visually. But these libraries allow us to render the components outside of a traditional browser environment. What they do is actually render these components in what's called a virtual DOM. What that basically means is an environment that simulates a real-life browser, but doesn't actually have a visual component. Because remember, at the end of the day, what we see in the browser can be represented in plain data structures, right? It's just a tree of nodes. At the very top, we have our HTML node, and then below that, we have our head and body nodes, and then maybe a div and an unordered list. We can represent that structure in regular JavaScript without needing to necessarily render the visual part of it. And that's really all that a test needs, right? Because it can take a look at what a component is supposed to render, simulate that in this kind of sandbox playground environment that doesn't actually have a visual element to it, but can still simulate the rendering of a component. And then we can interact with that kind of simulated component in that test environment. And Enzyme and React Testing Library are both focused on that. The technical word they use is mounting a React component, which basically means instantiating it and rendering it to this virtual DOM. Now, that's kind of the technical definition of what's going on behind the scenes, but you'll see when you write the tests, it's going to be much more intuitive. We're going to use the same React syntax we use anywhere else to simply render the component, and it's just going to work out of the box. There's two primary testing options, Enzyme and React Testing Library, and we're going to go with the latter in this course. One reason why we're going to go with React Testing Library over Enzyme is that Enzyme is actually no longer being actively maintained. But as a little bit of history, Enzyme is an NPM library that was originally developed by Airbnb, and its focus was really extensive integration with React and the idea of components. So you can really dig in deep and modify components in any way that you wanted to. So for example, there were methods on this library to automatically set a component state or modify it on the fly or change props instantaneously, right? So it allowed you kind of extensive access into the internals of a React component to manipulate it. And while that does sound kind of advantageous at first, it does have its share of weaknesses. And the biggest weakness, of course, is that we're not really emulating the true user experience in the browser. The user doesn't see a React component. The user sees HTML elements that render themselves to the screen, to the DOM. So one of the big criticisms for Enzyme was it was a little too focused on testing the React component as a component rather than testing the end value to the user, rather than testing the purpose of the component or how it was being used in the real world. It was almost like a technical test for the sake of the developer rather than a user test to verify that the component did what it's supposed to do. So the paradigm of the React testing library, NPM library, which I think is a little bit more recent in the history of React testing, is that it's more focused on testing user behavior. So it's less concerned about whether, for example, you are using class components or function components, and more concerned with what is actually being rendered to the screen. Is it a button, right? And what happens when the user clicks on that button, right? And even its API, which means the collection of methods that is available inside it, is focused on the idea of interacting with the component's elements in the way that a user would. So you're not really allowed to do things like set component state. You're only allowed to interact with the component the exact same way that the user would in the browser, right? So if you want to modify component state, you'll have to do something like click the button in the component that modifies the state. You can't actually reach into that component with JavaScript and modify it yourself because that's not how the functionality is meant to be used by the end user in the browser. So the spirit of React testing library is rendering the component and using it as it would be in the browser and having the tests simulate that kind of spirit, that kind of experience. We're going to see some of this syntax as we learn React testing library and see how it kind of prevents us from going too technical and keeps us focused on the user value. But again, the primary reason for why we're using React testing library is that it is still actively supported as of 2022. It's very popular. It, as I mentioned, has these development paradigms that are typically lead to strong tests, good tests that test behavior rather than implementation and make the tests more adaptable to change. There are just good design advantages of this library, which is why it is a popular and great choice for learning testing for React. So these two libraries are specifically related to rendering our React components, but the supplementary technology that we'll be using is called Jest. So what Jest is a test runner developed by Facebook. So the test runner is the NPM library that's actually going to execute our tests, check for the assertions we write, and the assertions are just the validations and verifications that we ask to confirm. Jest is going to be the program that runs through all of that logic. So it is a separate library from React testing library, but it pairs well. You are not obligated to use either library with the other, so you're welcome to use Jest on things outside of React, and you're also welcome to use React testing library with other test runners, but this combination is probably the most popular one today. Jest is just super popular. It's developed by Facebook, so it has the backing of a big enterprise company. It's up to date, it's modern, issues are addressed, bugs are resolved, that kind of thing. It's fast, it allows for concurrency. So it's a great choice for a test runner, and then React testing library pairs well with it and is a great choice for actually rendering our React components. So they're a good combo to be learned together, and certainly is a combination of tools that you can feel happy putting on your resume and saying, this is kind of the modern way to work with React testing, right? It's a modern stack, if you will. All right, one thing to know about Jest that will prove useful in future lessons is our test files are going to be plain JavaScript files, but they're going to end in a test.js or a spec.js extension. That's one of the design principles of Jest, is that test files must have that extension at the end of their file names. So just keep that in mind as we proceed. All right. Finally, to close this lesson off, I want to talk about a general principle or pattern in testing, and that is called the arrange, act, assert pattern. It's sort of a paradigm or a series of steps that you follow that describes how you should optimally write your tests. It's 3 phases that are meant to be done in order. The arrange phase is where we basically arrange whatever we need in order for the test to run. So we create our objects or any other pieces of data like arrays or strings, whatever we need in order to run the test. Then in the act phase is where we actually perform the event that we want to test, the action or the invocation, the instantiation, the method call, the function execution. Whatever it is that is being tested is what we call the act phase of this testing pattern. And finally, in the last phase, the assert phase, that's where we assert. To assert simply means to confirm or validate, to confirm that something is true. We confirm or validate that the action event that we undertook produced the expected output or result. So going back to our original example of invoking a function and testing the return value, in the arrange phase, we might do something like declare our constants or the arguments that are going to flow into the actual function. In the act phase is where we're actually going to invoke that function and maybe save that result to its own variable or constant. And then finally, in the assert phase is where we might take that final produced return value and check that it is equal to the expected result, which we'll also write in line. So that's kind of 3 phases, and many times when we write our code, we also like to separate these phases out in the test. So you'll notice that we are just going to add a line break between these 3 sections just to kind of signify here is the setup, which is the arrange phase, here is the execution, which is the act phase, and then finally here is the validation, which is the assert phase. All right, that's just a very quick introduction to testing. As always, the best way to learn this kind of stuff is to dive right into the code. So in the next lesson, we're going to start working with Jest, and then afterwards, we'll tackle the functionality of React testing library. So we're going to take things one step at a time, start with the general JavaScript testing library we need to know, and then add on React testing library as we proceed throughout this section. So lots of cool stuff to learn, a super helpful tool to have in your React toolbox, and I will see you in the next lesson.